The smell of burning skin filled the air as Karen held the lighter against my mother's ear. Rose screamed in pain, collapsing in her own garden. The HOA president smiled with satisfaction, not knowing she had just tortured an army general's mother. Karen's life was about to end. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The afternoon sun was perfect for gardening when 72-year-old Rose Martinez stepped outside to tend her flower beds. She moved slowly but with purpose, her weathered hands gentle as she watered the colorful blooms that had been her pride and joy for 30 years. The garden was her sanctuary, the one place where she felt completely at peace. Rose had lived in Willowbrook Gardens since 1994, back when it was a friendly neighborhood where people knew each other's names and helped during tough times. She had raised her 3 children in this house, watched them grow up playing in these same streets, and celebrated when her son Michael graduated from West Point Military Academy. Now at 72, Rose lived alone. Her husband Frank had passed away 2 years ago from cancer, leaving her with memories in a house that felt too big and too quiet. Her children lived far away. Michael was stationed at Fort Bragg as a 2-star Army general, her daughter Carmen was a doctor in California, and her youngest son David worked in New York. But Rose refused to move. This was her home, filled with 47 years of memories. Every room told a story, every corner held precious moments of her family's life. The garden especially reminded her of Frank, who had helped her plant every flower and tree with his own hands. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Martinez," called out her neighbor Janet Thompson from across the fence. "Your roses are looking beautiful this year." "Thank you, dear," Rose replied with a warm smile. "Frank always said that love makes flowers grow better than any fertilizer." Rose's routine was simple but meaningful. Every morning she would make coffee and sit on her front porch, watching the neighborhood wake up. In the afternoons she tended her garden, talking to her flowers as if they were old friends. In the evenings she would call one of her children or video chat with her 4 grandchildren. The neighborhood had changed dramatically over the years. Young families had moved in, bringing energy and noise that Rose actually enjoyed. She loved watching children play in the streets, reminding her of when her own kids were small. But there had been one change that made life much more difficult: the new HOA president, Karen Walsh. Karen Walsh was 55 years old and had moved to Willowbrook Gardens 3 years ago with her husband. She immediately ran for HOA president and won by promising to restore order and increase property values. What she really brought was fear and misery. Karen treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. She walked around with a clipboard and measuring tape, looking for violations of the extensive rules she had created. No detail was too small for her attention: the height of grass, the color of mailboxes, the placement of garden decorations, even the types of flowers people could plant. Rose had received dozens of violation notices from Karen over the past 2 years. Her mailbox was the wrong shade of blue. Her garden gnome was inappropriately placed. Her roses were blocking the sidewalk view. Each violation came with a fine, and Karen seemed to take pleasure in creating new rules just to catch Rose breaking them. The worst part was that Karen specifically targeted elderly residents and minorities. She never bothered the wealthy families on Elm Street, even when their violations were obvious. But she would spend hours looking for problems at Rose's house, taking photos and measurements like a detective at a crime scene. "Your garden is non-compliant again, Mrs. Martinez," Karen had said just last week, standing at Rose's fence with her clipboard. "Those sunflowers are 2 inches too tall according to Section 12.4 of the Landscaping Guidelines." "Karen, I've been gardening here for 30 years, Rose had replied politely. "These flowers bring joy to everyone who walks by. Surely a couple of inches doesn't matter." "Rules are rules," Karen had snapped. "If we let one person break them, soon everyone will think they can do whatever they want. That's how neighborhoods fall apart." Rose had paid the $150 fine just like she had paid all the others. On her fixed income, these fines were a real burden, but she was afraid of what Karen might do if she fought back. She had heard that Karen had put liens on other people's houses, forcing them to sell and move away. But today was different. Today Karen had gone too far. Rose was watering her prize-winning petunias when she heard the sharp clicking of high heels on the sidewalk. She looked up to see Karen marching toward her with a furious expression on her face. Karen was dressed in her usual expensive business suit, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless despite the afternoon heat. "Mrs. Martinez," Karen barked, her voice cutting through the peaceful afternoon air. "What do you think you're doing?" Rose was confused. "I'm watering my flowers, dear. Is there a problem?" "A problem?" Karen laughed bitterly. "Look at this mess. Your garden is completely out of compliance with HOA regulations. Rose looked at her garden, trying to see what Karen was talking about. The flowers were healthy and beautiful, the borders were neat and well maintained, and everything looked exactly as it had for years. I don't understand, Rose said gently. What exactly is wrong? Karen pulled out her measuring tape and began pointing aggressively at different areas of the garden. These marigolds are planted too close to the property line. That birdbath is 3 inches outside the approved decoration zone. And don't get me started on those wildflowers, they're not on the approved plant list. Rose felt her heart sinking. The wildflowers had been Frank's favorite. He had planted them himself just before he got sick. They were a mix of native species that attracted butterflies and birds, bringing life and color to the garden. Removing them would feel like losing Frank all over again. Karen, please, Rose said, her voice trembling slightly. Those wildflowers have been there for 3 years. My husband planted them before he passed away. They mean everything to me. I don't care about your personal feelings, Karen snapped. Rules are rules. Unapproved plants create an eyesore that brings down property values for everyone. But they're beautiful, Rose protested. The whole neighborhood enjoys them. Children stop to look at the butterflies and elderly people sit on my bench to enjoy the view. That's exactly the problem. Karen's voice rose to a shout. This isn't a public park. This is a private residential community with standards. Your sentimental attachment to some weeds doesn't give you the right to ignore community regulations. Rose felt tears forming in her eyes. At 72 years old, after burying her husband and living alone, these flowers were one of her few sources of joy. They connected her to Frank's memory and brought beauty into her daily routine. Please don't make me remove them, Rose whispered. They're all I have left of my husband. Your husband is dead. Karen screamed cruelly. Dead people don't need flowers. Living people need property values and community standards. The words hit Rose like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, clutching her chest as if Karen had punched her. No one had ever spoken about Frank so cruelly, with such complete disregard for her grief and loss. How dare you, Rose said quietly, her voice shaking with emotion. How dare you speak about my husband that way? I'll speak however I want, Karen snarled. I'm the HOA president, and I have the authority to enforce community standards. If you don't like it, you can move somewhere else. This is my home, Rose said, finding strength in her voice. I've lived here for 47 years. I raised my children here. I'm not going anywhere. We'll see about that, Karen said menacingly. I've had enough of your violations and your excuses. It's time to teach you a lesson about respecting authority. That's when Karen did something that changed everything. She pulled out a small butane lighter from her purse, the kind used for lighting cigarettes. Before Rose could understand what was happening, Karen grabbed Rose's arm with one hand and held the lighter flame directly against Rose's ear with the other. The pain was immediate and excruciating. Rose screamed as the flame burned her ear, the smell of singed skin and hair filling the air. She tried to pull away, but Karen held her arm tightly, keeping the flame pressed against her ear for several agonizing seconds. Stop. Please stop. Rose cried out, tears streaming down her face as the fire burned her skin. Karen finally released her and stepped back, a satisfied smile on her face. Maybe now you'll understand that I'm serious about enforcing the rules. Rose collapsed to her knees, clutching her burned ear. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, sharp, burning agony that seemed to spread through her entire head. She could feel blood and fluid dripping from the wound. You're insane, Rose gasped through the pain. You burned me? You actually burned me. I taught you a lesson, Karen corrected coldly. Actions have consequences. Break the rules, suffer the results. Rose looked up at Karen through her tears, seeing a complete lack of remorse or humanity in the woman's eyes. This wasn't just about HOA rules anymore. This was pure sadistic cruelty. Help! Rose called out weakly. Someone help me. But the street was empty. Most people were at work, and those who were home were inside with their air conditioning running. Rose was alone with her attacker. No one's coming to save you, Karen said with obvious satisfaction. And even if they were, who would believe that a respected HOA president would do such a thing? It would be your word against mine. Karen leaned down closer to Rose, who was still kneeling on the ground holding her burned ear. Now, about those wildflowers. You have 24 hours to remove every single one, or I'll be back with something worse than a lighter. With that threat, Karen turned and walked away, leaving Rose bleeding and traumatized in her own garden. Rose managed to crawl to her house and call 911. The paramedics arrived within 10 minutes, followed by police officers who took photos of her injuries and listened to her story with shocked expressions. "Ma'am, this is a serious assault," Officer Rodriguez told her as the EMTs treated her burned ear. "We're going to arrest Mrs. Walsh immediately." "She said no one would believe me," Rose whispered, wincing as the medic cleaned her wound. "We believe you," Officer Rodriguez assured her. "And we have physical evidence of what she did." At the hospital, doctors confirmed that Rose had suffered second-degree burns to her ear and the surrounding area. She would need skin grafts and would likely have permanent scarring and hearing loss. The attack could have been much worse. If Karen had held the flame longer, Rose might have lost her entire ear. While Rose was being treated, she called her son Michael at Fort Bragg. As a two-star Army general, Michael was used to handling crises, but nothing had prepared him for this phone call. "Mom, what happened?" Michael asked, his voice tight with concern after hearing his mother's shaky voice. "Karen Walsh burned my ear," Rose said, still hardly believing it herself. "She held a lighter to my ear because she was angry about the wildflowers Dad planted." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Michael spoke again, his voice was cold and controlled, the voice of a military commander who was about to go to war. "Are you in the hospital?" he asked. "Yes, but I'll be okay. The doctors say." "I'm flying out tonight," Michael interrupted. "Don't worry about anything else. Just focus on getting better." "Michael, you don't need to." "Mom, someone attacked my mother with fire. I'm coming home, and that woman is going to pay for what she did." After hanging up, General Michael Martinez immediately called his aide and ordered a military transport to North Carolina. He also made several other phone calls, to lawyers, to federal investigators, and to contacts in various government agencies. Karen Walsh had made the mistake of attacking the mother of one of the Army's highest-ranking officers. She was about to discover that some enemies are too dangerous to make. Michael arrived at the hospital that evening, still wearing his Army dress uniform with its impressive array of ribbons and insignia. At 52 years old, he was an imposing figure, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with the bearing of a man who had commanded thousands of soldiers in combat. "How are you feeling, Mom?" he asked gently, sitting beside her hospital bed and taking her hand carefully. "Better now that you're here," Rose said, managing a weak smile. "But I'm scared, Michael. That woman is crazy. She said she'd come back with something worse if I don't remove Dad's flowers." "She's not coming near you again," Michael said firmly. "I promise you that." Over the next few hours, Michael learned everything about Karen Walsh's reign of terror in Willowbrook Gardens. He spoke with neighbors who had been harassed, elderly residents who had been forced to move, and families who had been bankrupted by frivolous fines. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had used her position to systematically abuse vulnerable people while enriching herself through corrupt practices. Karen had been embezzling money from the HOA, taking kickbacks from contractors, and using her authority to settle personal grudges. But attacking Rose Martinez was different. Karen had crossed a line from harassment into violent assault, and she had done it to the wrong person's mother. The criminal charges were filed immediately. Karen was arrested at her home and charged with aggravated assault, elder abuse, and reckless endangerment. The bail was set at $500,000, which her husband paid using their house as collateral. But the criminal charges were just the beginning of Karen's problems. Michael used his military connections to launch a federal investigation into Karen's activities. The FBI became involved when evidence emerged of mail fraud, wire fraud, and civil rights violations. The IRS began auditing Karen's finances after discovering unreported income from her embezzlement schemes. More importantly, Michael hired the most expensive and ruthless legal team in the state to file a massive civil lawsuit against Karen, the HOA, and the management company that had allowed her to operate without oversight. The lawsuit alleged that Karen had created a pattern of harassment and intimidation targeting elderly residents and minorities. It included detailed documentation of every fine, every violation, and every instance of discriminatory enforcement over the past 3 years. The media attention was immediate and intense. HOA President Burns' elderly woman's ear became a national story that dominated news cycles for weeks. Karen's picture appeared on television screens across the country as reporters described her brutal attack on a grieving widow. The story resonated with people who had their own experiences with abusive HOA officials. Support poured in from across the nation, including donations to help with Rose's medical expenses and legal fees. But the most damaging coverage came when other victims began speaking out. Families who had been too afraid to complain about Karen's abuse suddenly found the courage to tell their stories. Mrs. Chin, an 80-year-old widow, described how Karen had forced her to remove a memorial garden for her deceased son. The Martinez family, no relation to Rose, told about how Karen had called immigration authorities on them despite their legal status, simply because she didn't like having Hispanic neighbors. The Johnson family revealed that Karen had tried to have their autistic son removed from the neighborhood, claiming his stymieing behaviors violated noise ordinances. The Williams family described how Karen had targeted them with violations after they refused to remove a Black Lives Matter sign from their yard. Every story painted the same picture. Karen Walsh was a racist, sadistic woman who had used her position to terrorize anyone she considered undesirable. The criminal trial began 6 months after the attack. Karen's expensive defense team tried to argue that the incident was an accident, that she had been lighting a cigarette and Rose had somehow gotten too close to the flame. But the prosecution had video evidence from Rose's doorbell camera that showed the entire attack. The jury watched in horror as Karen deliberately grabbed Rose's arm and held the lighter flame against her ear while Rose screamed in pain. Even more damaging was Karen's own testimony. Under cross-examination, she continued to show no remorse for her actions. Mrs. Martinez was repeatedly violating HOA regulations, Karen said from the witness stand. Someone had to take action to protect property values. So you decided to burn an elderly woman's ear? The prosecutor asked. I was trying to get her attention, Karen replied coldly. She wasn't listening to verbal warnings. You held a flame against a 72-year-old woman's ear for several seconds. How is that getting her attention? Sometimes people need to experience consequences before they understand the importance of following rules. The courtroom was silent as Karen's words sank in. Even her own lawyer looked horrified by her complete lack of remorse. The jury deliberated for only 90 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. Karen was sentenced to 5 years in state prison and ordered to pay $2 million in damages to Rose. But the state charges were only the beginning. The federal investigation had uncovered evidence of a massive corruption scheme. Karen had stolen over $800,000 from the HOA over 3 years, using the money to fund her lavish lifestyle while imposing crushing fines on working families. She had also been operating an illegal surveillance network, installing hidden cameras to spy on residents and collect blackmail material. The FBI found evidence that she had been selling information about neighbors' personal lives to debt collectors and private investigators. Most seriously, the Justice Department charged Karen with federal civil rights violations for her systematic targeting of elderly residents and minorities. The evidence showed a clear pattern of discriminatory enforcement designed to force unwanted residents out of the neighborhood. The federal trial revealed the full scope of Karen's crimes. Dozens of families testified about years of harassment and intimidation. Financial experts detailed the embezzlement scheme. Civil rights activists described how Karen's actions violated fundamental constitutional protections. General Martinez testified about the impact of the attack on his mother, describing how a woman who had never hurt anyone had been traumatized by someone who was supposed to protect the community. My mother survived the Great Depression, raised 3 children as an immigrant family, and nursed my father through cancer, Michael said from the witness stand. She has faced every challenge with grace and dignity. But this woman's cruelty and violence broke something inside her that may never heal. The federal jury found Karen guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to an additional 15 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $10 million in restitution to her victims. Karen appealed both convictions, but every appeal was denied. She would spend the next 20 years of her life in prison, and when she was finally released, she would be a broken, elderly woman with no money, no home, and no one who cared about her. But Michael wasn't finished with his revenge. He used his military connections and legal resources to ensure that Karen's life was completely destroyed. Her house was seized and sold to pay restitution. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her pension was revoked. Every asset she had accumulated through her crimes was taken away. More importantly, Michael made sure that Karen's story became a permanent warning to others. He worked with civil rights organizations to create new laws protecting elderly residents from HOA abuse. He testified before Congress about the need for federal oversight of homeowner associations. Karen Walsh became a national symbol of HOA corruption and abuse. Her name appeared in textbooks, legal journals, and documentary films as an example of how power can corrupt and destroy lives. Meanwhile, Rose slowly recovered from her physical and emotional injuries. The burns healed, leaving permanent scars that reminded her daily of the attack. She lost some hearing in her damaged ear, and loud noises sometimes triggered panic attacks. But she refused to let Karen's cruelty destroy her spirit. With Michael's support, she sued the HOA and won a settlement that allowed her to hire full-time help and security for her home. She also established a fund to help other elderly victims of HOA abuse. Most importantly, Rose kept Frank's wildflowers. In fact, she expanded the garden, planting even more native species that attracted butterflies, birds, and children from throughout the neighborhood. "These flowers represent everything good in the world," Rose told a reporter who came to interview her. "They represent love, memory, beauty, and hope." Karen tried to destroy all of that with her hatred and violence. But love is stronger than hate, and beauty is stronger than cruelty. The new HOA leadership immediately rescinded all of Karen's arbitrary rules and refunded thousands of dollars in illegal fines. The neighborhood became a friendly, welcoming place again, where children could play without fear and elderly residents could tend their gardens in peace. Karen's former supporters abandoned her completely. Her bridge club expelled her. Her church asked her not to return. Her few friends crossed the street to avoid her during her brief time on bail. Even her husband eventually divorced her, unable to live with the shame of being married to someone who had tortured an elderly woman. He moved across the country and changed his name to escape the association with Karen's crimes. On the day Karen was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, Rose was in the courtroom with Michael and her other children. She watched quietly as the woman who had burned her ear was led away in handcuffs. "Are you satisfied with the sentence, Mom?" Michael asked as they left the courthouse. "I'm satisfied that she can never hurt anyone else," Rose replied. "That's all I ever wanted, for her to stop hurting innocent people." As they walked to their car, Rose reflected on the events of the past year. Karen Walsh had attacked her because she thought an elderly widow would be an easy victim. She had no idea that Rose's son was one of the most powerful military officers in the country, with the resources and determination to ensure complete justice. Karen had spent 3 years terrorizing vulnerable people, believing that her position made her untouchable. She learned too late that there are some families you don't attack, some lines you don't cross, and some consequences you can't escape. Rose still tends her garden every day, talking to Frank's wildflowers and remembering the love they shared for 47 years. The burns on her ear have healed, but the scars remain as a reminder of the day someone tried to destroy beauty with cruelty. Karen sits in her federal prison cell, serving her 20-year sentence and thinking about the moment she decided to burn an elderly woman's ear over some flowers. She lost everything: her freedom, her fortune, her reputation, and her future, because she couldn't control her need to hurt innocent people. The neighborhood children still stop by Rose's garden to watch the butterflies and listen to her stories. The wildflowers bloom brighter every year, reaching toward the sky in defiance of those who would destroy beauty for the sake of arbitrary rules. That's not revenge. That's justice. Anne Frank's flowers continue to grow beautiful and free, just as love should be.